It's weekly at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. But today, because of the US Thanksgiving and making time for our parents to be here, we are starting now at 9:30 p.m. So next week on, we'll be back on our 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Today, we'll be talking about, does Pretoria Agreement have a recipe for a lasting peace? How? We'll be asking this question, and our panelists will be answering from their perspective. And this will be based on the recent statement from International Crisis Group that was issued on November 23rd. The H panel and UMD Media, uh, in addition to the YouTube channel it has and online presence, it's also aired on satellite, and the satellite connection is on Yahsat under Horn Broadcasting Services, frequency 11843, polarization V, symbol rate 27500. So we are aired in the Horn of Africa from Asmara, Magala, Addis Ababa, and the Horn of Africa in general. So those who are following us on satellite, thank you for doing that. And the H panel is back. I'm glad today we have Duke Burbridge, Faisal Roblam, and after a long time of absence, Yusuf Gebrehawat is back today with H panel, and he has been touring Europe under Farsi for peace and democracy, a movement he is chairing, Eritrean seedling, I guess, for democracy and peace.
Yes.
So, thank you for coming, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving for all of you and everyone who is following us from the US. We'll start with the usual what stood out for each one of you. So, Dako, would you start today? What stood out for you? Luke?
Oh, yeah. What stood out for me was actually a couple things, but the most recent was this morning an announcement, a joint announcement by the logistics cluster who's responsible for coordinating humanitarian assistance into Tigray. A joint report by them and the Ethiopian government claiming that around 17,000 metric tons of food entered. It's very worrisome that this report came out and the way it did, and that it's been accepted by the UN. They sort of flirted with this before about unconfirmed reports coming from the Ethiopian government about food getting in or about aid being distributed. They did this for a while in Western Tigray, but they decided that it wasn't credible enough, and so they stopped doing it until the most recent round. Now they have put out this statement saying that there's somewhere around 14,500 metric tons more than the World Food Program was able to get in has entered Tigray, and it's very hard to understand if that's actually the case or not. How they are distinguishing the food that's arriving for humanitarian assistance from food that's arriving to feed soldiers, I have no idea. And the frightening part is I don't think they do either. I don't think this has been confirmed by the logistics cluster, by the UN, because if this was normal traffic of humanitarian goods, it would have just been a logistics cluster report. So this is very worrisome because what it appears is that they're setting up a parallel system to distribute aid in the Northwest Zone, which is a place where they desperately need aid. And so to not have the World Food Program do it, this is supposed to be the World Food Program's territory, is the Northwestern Zone. This is supposed to be where they're focused. They haven't been able to because they haven't been able to get fuel into Tigray. But to take that and now make that under the supervision of the Ethiopian government is the last thing that they want to see happen. Also, in a UN OCHA update on the 17th, they reported that around 312,000 people in Shire had been fed. had received ration. They didn't say how much the ration was. But when I followed up on that with the World Food Program, they said that they were, quote, confused and curious about that figure and where that came from because it was not reported through them. This is more than just catching the Ethiopian government in a lie or something like that. This is more than just that. This is if they say that they delivered food to 312 people in Shire, or if they say that they brought in 14,500 metric tons of food, then that means the rest of the humanitarian response will then ignore those people for that period of time. So if they're lying about distributing food to 312,000 people, that is very detrimental to those people because then they are no longer on the books as somebody that's going to be receiving food in this cycle. So they need to get to the bottom of this. This is the second worst thing. The worst thing that could happen is that no food gets in ever, and that's the worst thing. But this is the second worst thing, is that the Ethiopian government starts up their own parallel system of distributing humanitarian aid in Tigray. This is a very bad sign.
Thank you for that. Yosef, I am sure you have a lot to say because you have been traveling. But if we were to highlight what stood out for you over the past week, what would that be?
Uh, you're right. I was watching Eritrea's, if you can say it, Eritrea's behavior inside Tigray. It's a kind of tantrum that it has been doing. There has been a lot of things. So, for one, Eritrean soldiers have been coming. Additional Eritrean soldiers have been coming to Tigray. And why is it doing? I have no idea, but my hunch tells me that since the disarmament of TDF is being connected to the return of Eritrean soldiers back to Eritrea, then they are trying to kind of mess up with the numbers. If they have, for example, let's say if they add up 5 or 6 divisions, then it's easy for them to return back to Eritrea and then ask for the TDF to be disarmed. So that kind of thing is going on inside Tigray. And then, of course, the usual plunder that the Eritrean soldiers are known for has also been going on. But in general, what I'm looking at is that there is some kind of, inside Eritrea, there is some kind of tragic comedy that's making its presence felt now, even among the Eritrean authorities. By tragic comedy, I mean, if you look at the all totalitarian regimes, or all, dictators in general, be it Idi Amin or the Kim Il Sungs of Korea, you always see, if you are from outside, in many ways they make you laugh, at the way they do things. But for the insiders, for the people that are inside the regimes, it's no laughing matter because it has huge humanitarian consequences what they do. The same kind of thing is going on inside Eritrea right now. They know that there are absolutely no clear objective in this war. If you look carefully, what was Eritrea supposed to gain out of this war? What was its objective in terms of very tangible, objectives, very tangible goals? You would find nothing at all. People haven't been asking that because of the, of the bigness of all that's happening inside Tigray. For example, if you look at the Amharas, even though they have been genocidal, in all the things that they have been doing, they have a clear objectives. They are looking for land, for example, Walqait and Raya. They are also looking if they can, to bring an end to federalism. So these are clear objectives that the Amhara elite aim. So is it with Abiy. Abiy has a clear objective when it comes to what he's trying to do. In order to retain his power and in order to weaken federalism, he thought that Tigray was the real, it's a hard nut to crack. If he cracked Tigray, then he could do the rest would be easy for him. So Abiy too had a clear objective in what he's doing, even though I mean the means, as I said before, is genocidal. But in Eritrea, it's funny, there is nothing that we could mention, as a clear objective, and that has struck the people inside Eritrea and some of the, and there is a fear now in Eritrea, almost a primordial fear inside the Eritrean government of what will follow if this peace agreement goes through. Because in the end, it means that if Eritrea loses in the battlefield, it loses. If Eritrea wins in the battlefield, it loses. That has been clear. It has been the useful idiot in this war. It has been useful for Ethiopia, for Abiy, because without Eritrea, the siege of Tigray wouldn't have been successful. It has been useful for the Amharas for the same reason. It has even been useful for the US, because the US also has been looking for this kind of agreement to come when the siege is still going on. So it has been a useful idiot for all these actors without realizing that it has absolutely no goal or no gains from this war. So that has been what I have been observing in this week. Probably, it's kind of, I have been looking at it before, but from the way people are responding inside Eritrea and from the way the government is reacting in a very paranoid way, it seems that it has sunk into the people. What were we doing? I mean, what were we doing in Tigray? After all, what were you doing in Tigray? That question is being asked right now. All right.
Thank you, Yosef, for that. Faisal, you have been following not only what's happening nationally on Ethiopia, in Tigray and so on, but also in eastern uh, Ethiopia, in Somali region, and so on. So, uh, highlights for you over the past 7 days.
Yes, I think both Joseph and Duke talked about key issues that really pertain to the burning issue, which is the conflict in Tigray. I think what stood out for me this week, among many other things, is Abiy's shift toward his purging, if you will, or cracking down on what he called corruption and embezzlement of public resources. As you know, the report has not come out yet, but there are already individuals that are the top echelon of the PP Prosperity Party who may be victims or candidates of this purging of the corruption. If you recall, the first time Prime Minister Abiy talked about the corruption in a huge way was, I believe, in last June or July at the PP convention. And at that time, if you recall, the leadership of two regions were prominently mentioned, both in the public gathering that he spoke, as well as behind the scene when PP cadres and leadership were addressing the issue of corruption. The two regions, the two areas or regions whose leadership became prominently featured in the corruption saga were the Amhara region as well as the Somali region. But the names that have appeared is now individuals, if the reports that we are hearing continues to be true. These two gentlemen, one Oromo, one Somali, particularly Ahmed Shide and the Minister of Industries, are supposed to be the key individuals, both of them to be indicted. I think the Ahmed Shide indictment, if it holds water, is very interesting because the trail of corruption from Addis Ababa to Jigjiga to Togo Jale is not only a regional issue, but it's also a national issue for Ethiopia as well as for the Horn of Africa. There have been for many, many months and years since particularly PP came to power, talks among Somalis who documented the leakage of huge monies of corruption and public resources that has trails all the way from Addis Ababa banks through the Francofluto or LC letters of businesses issued to people who import, all the way to Jigjiga, all the way to the border town of Tagwajale, then to Somaliland. Abiy specifically talked about this. It was not a secret. In June, July last year, he addressed how the Somali region is a center of leakage of dollars and gasoline or oil, where that black gold, if you will, also features. And one of the reasons is that he talked about why gasoline was not abundant in or available for the Somali drivers was because a huge percentage of the gasoline taken to the Somali region was literally passing through Jigjiga and ending up in Tagojale in Somaliland. Now, the saga of Ahmed Shide is not a new thing. In the early days of the regional reform, when Abdi Muhammad Umar alias Abdi Ile was removed from power and Mustafa Umar was brought from Nairobi with no previous experience in terms of administration at that level, the first thing that surfaced was a conflict between Mustafa, who was the young Turkey at the time, and Ahmed Shide, who was a holdover from EPRDF. At that time, Mustafa literally accused Ahmed Shide of being a member of a web of corruption that consisted of the leadership and military establishment of EPRDF that were in Harar, including Samora and those people who literally carried sort of, kind of exploitation through corruption, the Somali region. And Mustafa Umar at the time, not knowing the political terrain of how Ahmed himself he was entrenched in the Abiy camp, literally accused Ahmed Shide and his sister as being the focus of a network of corruption. Now, some of the corruption being charged against Ahmed is indicting not only him, but his sister that Mustafa Umar mentioned 3.5 years ago. And the charges are now very specific as to what Ahmed Shide and others did. But in the case of Ahmed Shide, there are apartments that he has bought for hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are other investments that are beyond his salary. And I tweeted last week where I said people need to live, should not live beyond their means. And I specifically was privy of the issues that Ahmed would be subject to, but the entire leadership of the Somali region is living beyond their means of whatever the salary is. It is uncommon. No, it's not uncommon to find in the Somali region a local regional minister whose salary is about 4,000, 5,000 birr, but owns a mansion and several businesses. One of the most painful things that I hope the Abiy regime will go deep into investigating the corruption, of course, throughout Ethiopia, but in the Somali region, is Getachew. There is an open market bazaar type plaza called Taiwan Market, where low-income mothers and fathers and people who toil during the day used to sell different types of merchandise, clothing, shoes, cigarettes. It's an open market, like any other bazaar that you see. I think it's called Taiwan. In Dredo also it's called Taiwan. A single individual has been given to that entire land, which is in the center of the city, displacing those people, carrying gentrification without a penny of revenue to the government. I'm reading a textbook case of a grandiose corruption that happened in the Somali region. And that Taiwan today is turned quote unquote into a plaza. Whether that plaza would be completed or not, we don't know. But we do know that hundreds of low-income poor mothers, mainly women, whom the American embassy in 1993 invested I think it was Brasilia at the time. I went to Jijiga and I participated at a dinner where Brasilia, of the then U.S. ambassador, participated and earmarked money specifically for the women at Taiwan market. All those, after so many years of building asset in the spaces that they occupy, have been displaced and dismantled for one person who has given to the state a zero revenue. So land is not only given to him, but entire lives of thousands of people who depend on those mothers have been disrupted. Corruption is a very serious issue in Ethiopia, whose account has yet to be written. Today, I think the biggest issue of Addis Ababa is how people get their driving license. The Ethiopian TV has been featuring how people who never visit the DMV get his class 1, class 2, and class 3 driving license, therefore causing serious accidents. Corruption permeates in every aspect of life, but I think in the case of Jijiga, it's that issue I talk. I think in the case of the Minister of Industry, he has embezzled monies and contracts from minerals, but I have a suspicion that he has a big hand in the Ogaden oil. Remember, he was the person who was managing the entire Ogaden oil, the revenues, the commission is given to different gurus. I think him and President Mustafa and Ahmed Shide are this tripartite entity that has also carried a level of corruption never seen in the rest of Ethiopia that pertains to the oil of the Ogaden. And I think more stories would come. And at least finally, I found an issue where I encourage Abiy to follow through. Of course, I'm not oblivious to the issue that in Africa and in autocratic governments, usually the purge of corruption is used to clean up bureaucracy and politically unkosher individuals. It may as well be that, and only few people will be targeted. But the very fact that names who have been central, including the priest who has been carrying the mantle for the genocide, Daniel Kibret, is also being mentioned in internal memos. It's really heartening and a good way to go about some of these corruption issues in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Faisal. Related to that, there are unconfirmed or unverified reports that this newly established anti-corruption national committee or anti-corruption national committee by the prime minister and the Somali region president is making behind the scene dealing in terms of avoiding this probe and so on. So we'll follow that. Maybe Faisal, you'll reflect on that when there is and if there is any new information in the coming weeks. Let's talk. Thank you, both. I mean, everyone for the what stood out for you. So let's talk to the topic of the day. Does Pretoria Agreement, which was signed on November 1st, have a recipe for a lasting peace? And if yes, how? Or if not, why not? So we are basing today's discussion on this report statement from the International Crisis Group that came out this week on the 23rd of November, turning the Pretoria deal into lasting peace in Ethiopia. And Crisis Group started with what developed on November 2020, and then went into a number of details chronologically. Some of them, missing important points in my view. Some of them having, what could be cautioned and so on, but also coming with some proposals and so on. So let's start with Joseph. Um, the first question is what we asked in the topic. Do you see any form of recipe for lasting peace in the Pretoria Agreement? And what is your reading of the International Crisis Group's report or statement this week? Joseph? Yusuf, I can't hear you if you are speaking. I think you are muted, maybe.
All right, okay. It's not an easy question to answer because uh, we have yet to know exactly what has been going on in Pretoria, not only on the terms of agreement, but on how it is being interpreted from both sides, both from the Ethiopian and the TPLF side. Uh, for me, there are certain questions. What led to this agreement? I mean, we have to go back and ask this question. What led to this agreement? Why is this agreement successful? Successful in quotation marks. Why did the US wait until this moment to put the kind of pressure that it has put, for example, on Ethiopia and on Tigray? Could it have been done earlier? To me, these are the questions that we have to answer if we are to really know the nature of this agreement. For example, the siege of Tigray, it's very important to understand the siege of Tigray. Without the siege of Tigray going on the way it has been going on, this kind of agreement couldn't have been achieved. So what I mean is the architects of the siege are, of course, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Amhara. But to me, the most important part is the role of the USA in maintaining the siege, be it directly or indirectly. And I think we have looked at this, Getachew, before, but we have seen that at any moment that the Tigrayans seem to break out of the siege, there has always been the intervention of the US. For example, the first attempt was when they reached Debre Birhan. They were almost at the gates of Addis Ababa. And it's believed that the US had a heavy-handed presence at that time on why they went back to, returned back from Debre Birhan to Mekelle. Most of all, it's believed to have the green light to Turkey and UAE to go ahead with their drone attacks. So the second one is the role that the US have played in regard to Western Tigray. That being another possibility for the TPLF to break out from the siege. And we know that in Western Tigray, at the beginning, the US was loudly claiming that there had been an ethnic cleansing going on. In fact, it was Blinken himself, the Secretary of State Blinken himself, that stated that a massive ethnic cleansing is going on in Western Tigray. More than 1 million people were displaced then. But it didn't take time, not even 2 or 3 months, for the US to change its mind. The reason became clear. I believe part of it is what the EU and also incidentally or not so incidentally ICG itself that have been propagating that if Tigray gains Western Tigray, then it will have an access to Sudan, and the result of that, the Ethiopian sovereignty and the integrity will be threatened. Now, if you have seen at every time, every critical time, the US has been always saying we are always for Ethiopia's sovereignty and integrity, territorial integrity. So that has been the priority of the US, even as hundreds of thousands of people were dying inside Tigray. So to me, it seems that it has been clear that even though, I mean, of course, it wouldn't say so openly, that the siege of Tigray became a precondition for reaching the kind of agreement that the US wants, such as the one that has been reached in Pretoria. It believed that the US believed that unless the TPLF is weakened enough to almost surrender the way it did in Pretoria, then it will not intervene. It will not push Ethiopia to accept the peace process. So it has to wait until this moment to put the pressure, the kind of pressure that it has put in Pretoria to both Ethiopia and Tigray. So to me, we have to understand the nature of how they reached into this agreement to see if this Pretoria agreement will have a lasting effect. Because inside Tigray right now, if they accept this, they have already accepted this peace agreement, but despite the objections of almost the entire diaspora elite, the elite of Tigray, and much of the population of Tigray. So because of that, will it have a peace agreement? Will it be lasting? Will it have a lasting? Will this peace be a lasting one? I'm not sure. But to go back to what they call the ICG. If you look at ICG, if you carefully read at what the ICG report has been, it's notable for what for what it has carefully omitted in its diagnosis of the conflict. First of all, the overarching issue that of the conflict, the threat to the federal arrangement in Ethiopia is never mentioned there. Instead, for example, that the fact that the Abiy government identified Tigray as the main obstacle to their centralizing mission, that thing has never been mentioned there. And then the fact that the genocide in Tigray has killed more than 500,000 civilians is never mentioned in the report. It's very careful not to undermine Abiy in the entire report, and most notably, it never mentions on how the last round of war has been conducted. Remember that the last round of war that has been conducted from the Eritrean side, from Adiabo, is totally different from the way the war has been fought throughout these 2 years. One of the lessons that the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian government has learned from their previous war inside Tigray was that a guerrilla warfare inside Tigray is not winnable. They know that from that experience, from the early experience, from the 2020s and the early 2021. They know that they couldn't win the war, even though the number of the Tigrayan forces at that time didn't amount more than 20,000 at the beginning. Now that the Tigrayan forces are around 200,000, they have concluded that they could never win a guerrilla warfare inside Tigray. So what did they do? What they did was it's a massive, brutal plan was framed in Asmara. The idea was once you get inside Adiabo, which is a flat land, it's probably one of the most fertile areas of Tigray. What they did was they forced the entire population in Adiabo to they displaced the entire population in Adiabo towards the central Tigray. It's the same plan that the Amharas did in Western Tigray. Remember, when they entered Western Tigray, the Amharas felt unless they displaced the more than 1 million Tigrayans to the center of Tigray, they will be facing a guerrilla warfare inside Western Tigray. And they were very successful in doing that. Once they displaced it, they faced no resistance inside Western Tigray. So that blueprint came from the Western Tigray experience. So what they did was they forced the entire Shararo area, you know, that Adiabo area, Bozlalai, Adiabo, and Tahta Adiabo, about 500,000 people were forced. But not only that, all those that were displaced from Western Tigray and were in Shire were also further displaced, which means 500,000 more were added to them. And once they entered Shire, Adwa and Aksum, the plan was to displace the entire area of Aksum, Adwa, Shire further into the Tembian area to inside Tigray. This way, they would create a huge humanitarian crisis. The idea was if they were successful, then they would go on doing that throughout Tigray, and they would have 3 or 4 million people concentrated in a certain area, probably half of which will definitely die, about 2 or 3 million of them. And that is how they intended to achieve this success. Now, what happened was, to their credit, the Tigray leadership, the TPLF leadership realized it a little bit late, but they realized how the strategy was working, and they quickly wanted a ceasefire. That is how the ceasefire came to be. Now, this scenario, you don't see it in the ICG report because they don't want to give the impression to the outside world that the Eritreans, the Amharas, and the Abiy government were undertaking a huge genocidal project in doing this. They simply wanted to portray that a war has been going on and somehow the Tigrayans lost. So that is the third one that I have seen. The fourth one is they say almost nothing productive on the territorial integrity of Tigray. The ICG, the International Crisis Group, has been one of those who have always been putting doubt on the idea that the Western Tigray belongs to Tigray from the very beginning. If you go back to all the articles that they have written, and we have talked about that before, that is what they have been doing, and that's exactly what they have been doing right now. What they are doing right now in this report of theirs. But in general, there is one thing more that I want to add why I'm pessimistic about the Pretoria Peace Agreement. That is what I call the elephant in the room. Not the elephant in the room that Getachew Reda talks about. Getachew Reda talks about the Eritrean presence in Tigray as the elephant in the room. But that is totally wrong. The elephant in the room is Abiy himself, the ENDF itself. The ENDF is as criminal, as genocidal, as the Eritrean army and as the Amhara, Farnos and Liuhail, the Amhara forces. These three partners have all been, working together in the genocide of Tigray. Now, the idea that somehow the ENDF is going to enforce the peace in Tigray, that's probably the greatest cruel joke that is being played against the people of Tigray. Yet, you don't see this mentioned even by the Tigrayan leadership, precisely because the premise of all the agreements that they have entered right now presuppose that somehow Abiy could conduct this peace agreement without believing, at least whether they believe it internally or not, it doesn't matter, without believing that Abiy is going to enforce, this peace agreement, that the ENDF is going to do the peacekeeping inside Tigray. But somehow, if the Eritrean forces are removed and the Amhara forces are removed, the ENDF will do wonders inside Tigray. Is bogus by itself. Precisely because, a genocide, once a genocider, it's always a genocider. It's not only Isaias that is a genocider. Abiy is a full-fledged genocider as Isaias. He has killed more than half a million civilians in Tigray. And it's not, I mean, this is not also an aberration, because it's the same thing is happening when it comes to Oromos. That's exactly what he is doing right now. So the idea that somehow genociders always want to finish the job. By hook or by crook, they want to finish the job, and that's what they are going to trying to do. So that's what makes me pessimistic about this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Well, Faisal, what's your reading of the ICG statement? I will come back to you, Doka, on that, especially from the humanitarian lens as well. Faisal, in terms of how you were analyzing this war, and you also mentioned obviously that eventually it would have to end somehow with negotiation and this kind of talks and so on. So we did not so scientific poll here on UMBD Media, and we were asking people to grant what they saw in terms of the explanations from the officials, specifically Getachew Reddas and Tzadkan ገብረትንሳኤስ. And out of 1,179 people who responded, um, around 29.9% said they were happy, satisfied. The rest were between confused, saddened, and a third option was concerned. And I'm emphasizing that it's very hard to make any scientific analysis of that, but it gives us some basis to talk about. When you ask people in Tigray with the limited connection we have, we see that they are hoping for peace because they want to eat, they want to get medication, and so on. So, with that background, what is your answer, for example, for the direct question: does Pretoria Agreement have a recipe for a lasting peace, and how?
Yeah, let me start with that and then probably come back to the reflections that you just mentioned and my take on that, given the history of TPLF. I think when I read the ICG report, it reads to me your typical NGO type assessment of the Pretoria deal. And why do I say NGO and what do I mean by NGO assessment? NGOs live of projects, and they live of projects often that work with governments. ICG was kicked out of Ethiopia largely, and one thing that they want is if the peace holds, ICG would want to come back to Ethiopia and conduct research, a 120 million country, an anchor country in the Horn of Africa, the second most populous African country where you have a lot of institutions. There isn't an NGO, let alone ICG, that studies conflict in the Horn of Africa is the epitome of conflict. I think they used this report to really brush up their image with Abiy and Ethiopia and put a lot of the blame on TPLF and Tigray. There's a catching in one of the last parts of the recommendations. They are advising Abiy to be generous. Generous, that's a moral word. Generous to propagate and publicize peace. And then they say on the part of TPLF and Tigrania leadership, they should stop pursuing extremist policies and the peril and recognize the peril of war. So basically, for Abiy, they appeal to his heart as a great leader to be generous to his subjects. And they will say Ethiopians all over. And then when it comes to the TPLF and Tigrania leadership, they painted them as with the image of extremists who are causing and pursuing the perils of war. That says it. Every other thing is a fill in. I think largely the report, when you read it and you know Africa's problem, it's a agreement that we need badly and a peace that people are crying for. But the very fact that AU and African monitors are entrusted to implement this has two things. Either it would be a corrupt product, whatever comes out, which is already coming out, and I will say that what I mean by that, or it will fail because of ineptness of the monitor, the people who monitor and their lack of capacity. I think the ambiguity and the early different interpretation is already coming out from different corners of this agreement, points us to the direction that this hostility cessation, and it's not a ceasefire. A ceasefire is when you completely stand by saying that we will not start any war. Cessation of hostility is just silencing the gun, and it could start, anything can trigger. Eritrean involvement can trigger, Amara involvement can trigger, anything else can trigger. So the cessation of hostility by its nature is precarious. The other thing that can lead to the downfall of this agreement is the multiple interpretation different parts are giving to it. Abiy and his team see this as the document that proves to them the capitulation of TPLF and Tigranian leadership, period. From day one, Abiy went to Gomgofra, and I said this, and he said we got 100% what we want. The only response that the Tigranian leadership at this point in time can give to that is what I said here and what yesterday Reda said, that nobody claims or can claim that in a negotiated settlement they win 100%. But Abiy said he won 100%. So it's he said, she said at this point in time. That tells you that they don't have the same stance when it comes to that living document. And it's a binding document. And if two people don't agree on the contents and principles of the binding document, it's a problem. The other problem, and there are many, many problems, the disarmament is one, and DDR. I think Getachew Reda and TPLF correctly reflects, even if they accept it, they correctly reflect the meaning and the intent of what DDR is, that it's a multi-year program. 250,000 Tigrayans to be disarmed is pie in the sky for anybody to say that they can do this in 30 days or even in 6 months. You have to understand that of the 200 plus Tigranya army, maybe 1/3 could go to the hills and the mountains and say we are not disarming, and that will drag, which will turn TPLF and Tigranya local administration as the moderate force to negotiate between the radical elements of Tigrayans who go to the mountains, and nobody can figure out as to what would happen with that group. So I think that DDR, the way the government understands it and the way Abiy team understand, either they are lying to their people the same way TPLF, TDF people didn't tell their people everything. I think they are lying or they're hiding. Or at this point in time, they say, let us sit on it, let it take its course, let Reda and his team speak on that one, and then Abiy will speak on his favorite part of the agreement, which is we 100%. TPLF has been capitulating up to this point. If there isn't a midpoint that enhances confidence building, which was the first subjective that Duke talked about, humanitarian assistance being utilized as the tool to slowly build confidence between the two parties, show the Tigranian masses that both sides care about and are willing to feed them and give them the services that they want, then the DDR thing can be interpreted the way each wants, as long as you don't fire the fire, and it can take its course, and each one will tell their folks and their constituents whatever they want. I don't think that's happening. I think, as Duke said, in addition to the politicization of the DDR, which is nothing in the Pretoria Agreement, which should not have been anything but a framework. And a framework is often a long-term project and a long-term outlook. Outside that, I think the government of Ethiopia is already politicizing humanitarian term, which should not have been. We should have been the locomotive that's building the confidence between the two. That is only adding injury to an insult that Joseph mentioned, which is the Tigrania people have been asked, or Tigaro people have been asked to trust their genocider. It is a very, very uphill battle. To trust their genociders, to give their security of their children, their girls, their mothers, their aunties, who have already been subjected to rape, to the same forces, people like, Dabala, who is already eager to deny and said it was not the Ethiopian troops who did any crime, it was the Tigrania TPLF troops. I think you can tell what Joseph said is already on the ground, that now TPLF TDF has capitulated. The world has given us the green light to rule Tigray. Nobody challenged us on the genocide. America looked the other way when it came to genocide. Now NGOs like International Crisis Group are coming to blame TDF and Tigrania and not the Ethiopian government. And that report, he's right, says nothing about the crimes exacted against the people of Tigray and doesn't even mention International Crimes Court. Now, the good thing is this thing could fall apart. It can also hold if Abiy hears and listens to what this international crisis group said, although I don't agree with them, which is begging Abiy to be a big man, begging Abiy to go for the peace, with all the pain that the people of Tigray have seen all this time. Can Abiy be the medicine to heal these people? And that's what they're really trying to say in a diplomatic way. Is Abiy in a position to heal the wounds that he caused? I am not sure about that, especially when you see people who are around him and the way they are talking. Now, I give one credit to the TPLF TDF leadership up to this point. No matter what happened behind the closed doors in Pretoria, no matter what America either promised or threatened them, these people were seeing, as Joseph described, a Rwanda type, even worse, method and plan set up for that people to be decimated by two countries, Eritrea and Ethiopia. So for them to recognize and swallow their pride and say we will, save our people, I can give them that credit. The other credit I give them is at the expense of their own people. They have been lip tight up to this point, never crossed the line. I'm not talking about very well postured interviews that they give by mincing the words and by using diplomatic language like Reda did with the BBC. Never crossed anything, but he made his point. That I can tell. Tigray group at this point in time don't have any person from the leadership second guessing what has been happening, despite what people are blaming on them and saying they are backtracking, including the ICG report. When you look at the Tigray leadership's role and the way they interpret DDR, they have not. The very fact that they say it's impossible to accomplish disarmament of 200 plus thousand combatants in 30 days, they are 100% right. They are knowledgeable, they are right, and the other side is not telling the Ethiopians the truth and the thing. So having said that, I think probably we are seeing a sort of the downfall of TPLF, in my opinion. I think number one, TPLF made the cardinal mistake of not preparing its constituents for what was coming up. They have never prepared. I know they were in a war situation, but till a week ago, they never told their constituents what they did, what does this mean, and what are the implications that we are talking about. I don't know if they talk to their people in secrets, and the confusion that Getachew you mentioned is created by the extreme secrecy that TPLF has carried. Now, I'm not sure, but I think what has transpired in Pretoria, A, is very difficult to implement, particularly the way Ethiopia is behaving. B, it has angered and let down the people of Tigray, not only because TPLF signed or TDF signed the agreement, but because the world didn't come to them when they have been subject to genocide and siege. So they feel today very lonely and very alone on this planet. That is a feeling that's sinking among millions of Tigrayans. And three, the genocide issue has been, or war against humanity, has been completely neglected. The silver line on all this issue is that International Criminal Court doesn't care whether Abiy is protected by America or by international groups or by the African Union. The crime is committed by the Ethiopian government, and the Ethiopian army is there. It won't disappear. You have seen last week a former colonel of Ziad Barre was indicted in court in Washington, D.C., and he has been apprehended right in his house in Virginia after 30 plus years. People who have been participating in the genocide should put in their mind that no matter how long it takes, that thing will hang on their head. By the way, there are countries like England who has even boosted and augmented their human rights and war against humanity, genocide issues that the United Nations Convention stipulated, I think, in 1946. England even added more language to its regulations in 1977, and many other European countries. So those groups are only waiting for citizens of Ethiopians and people of the Horn of Africa and people of Tigray to just get together beyond politics and file litigation against those people, and it will never leave. And finally, I don't know how any Ethiopian leader at this point in time will earn the trust of the people of Tigray. They may get 10%, they may get few individuals who work with them, but I used to be very surprised as to the Somali case, which is an old, massacre and atrocity. I think when I look at this one, that one was a baby, and they haven't even gotten the trust of the Somalis after 100 plus years. How any Ethiopian leadership at this point in time, short of complete honesty conversation, which is absent, I don't know how they can get that. And because of that, the Pretoria Agreement is a half-baked agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal, for that. You mentioned about, I think this is what I was going to mention for Duke. In the document, in the crisis group statement, they talk about the past, about the present, and possibly about the future as well. Where, for example, here they clearly say the Tigrayans already backtracking on commitments, and about the future as well. They mention that here it's far from clear that Tigray is planning to hand over all its arms, even if Addis Ababa meets its obligation. And what is interesting for me is when it comes to the humanitarian aid, to the resuming services. I didn't read. Maybe I could be wrong, but I didn't read a clear and as bold as what we are seeing in terms of questioning Tigray in terms of what it's doing now and what it might or might be doing in the future. So what is your reading of this statement? And again, the same question to you, Duke. What is your take on if Pretoria, whether it has a recipe for a lasting peace or not? Because lasting peace is what ICG is talking about.
Yeah, it does. There is a recipe. in there for lasting peace, but that's all it is a recipe. It's like a recipe in a book. You need ingredients, you need a chef, you need everybody to put the recipe together and to make something. It's not like a magic spell that you can just say these things and then they all come true. I mean, if you look at the agreement, if you have no prior knowledge of what's happened, the brilliant overview given just a moment ago, if you don't have any pre-understanding of what has happened, then it's almost a cookie cutter peace agreement. I mean, before my focus was in the humanitarian area in Tigray, I was a peace builder for 15 years. I mean, I've seen a lot of these agreements, and I've seen a lot of them fail. And this could work if anybody was taking it very seriously, but there's already plenty of indications that it's not being taken seriously. And if it's not being taken seriously, then the best recipe in the world isn't going to make a cake, which is sort of what we're seeing here. Now, there's a couple of reasons that have been alluded to a little bit just tonight here. One is the fact that genocide, the blockade, was still on the table when they made this agreement. I mean, we're in uncharted territory as far as diplomacy. How do you create a process to off ramp a genocide, which is what's happening? There's no. I mean, now that we're seeing that the humanitarian aid is not materializing the way it should, if it's unhindered access, the way we're seeing that the Eritrean troops are still there, I mean, there was no reason to expect that not to happen. If those things that should have been preconditions to have negotiations, they should not have been the TPLF's preconditions, by the way. They should have been the AU's preconditions. They should have been the UN, the United States preconditions. That's the reason when the gentleman was saying, how did we get to the table? That's how we got to the table, is that for a year, from December 1, the TPLF was saying, here are the preconditions, open up the routes, get Eritrea out, and we'll come to the table. They said that for almost a year, and the United States and the UN, everybody who was supposed to back that play, because that was well within international humanitarian law, everybody who was supposed to back that just stepped away and said, well, okay, those are your conditions. We'll see what we can do about it. Of course, nothing was done about it. And we got to the negotiation table, and these things were still on the table. Now we're past the negotiations, and it seems that they're still on the table. It seems like we're still negotiating. Blinken had a conversation just, I believe it was a couple of days ago, about, can Eritrea please leave now that we have a peace agreement? And it's just, I mean, not Eritrea, but the party to be named later, or the third party, or whatever the hell they want to call it, in the negotiation. It just seems that nobody's taking this seriously. This is supposed to be a celebration of this great victory for the federal government, and why bother with the details of this celebration? It seems to be what's happening. When you get down to the nitty gritty, with the DDR, first off, it's not DDR. It's just DD. It's just demobilization, disarmament. If we're calling reintegration the reintegration of Tigray as a region back into the fold of Ethiopia, that's a whole different type of reintegration than we're used to seeing in a deal like this. It's supposed to be, individual, the fighters are supposed to be reintegrated back into society, the economy, the social and economic reintegration, trauma counseling, all that stuff is never going to happen. The federal government, I mean, we're here talking about whether the federal government can be trusted not to continue slaughtering people. The idea that the federal government's going to launch some, Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something like that is a farce. I mean, it's a joke. Nobody thinks that's going to happen. So, I mean, they can get rid of the heavy weapons. That's contingent on Eritrea leaving. Eritrea, and possibly, if the way you want to read it, the Amhara forces, Fano, the regional forces, everybody except the federal soldiers leaving. And that doesn't mean Eritrean soldiers in federal soldier uniforms. It means everybody but the federal soldiers. That's what happens for any of the disarmament to kick off. Now, they also have a timetable for light weapons. And as Faisal was saying, the idea that you're going to disarm Tigray. Now, I do not have the same level of experience with Tigray as I did in Yemen, but there was also, in their National Dialogue Conference, there was also a point in there that we were going to ban firearms. In Yemen, everybody has a firearm. Everybody has an AK. You don't, I mean, it's part of like masculinity to have an AK-47. It's just something that is ridiculous. And if it's in the agreement, it seems like who put that in the agreement? You know, they knew that wasn't going to happen. And so to Faisal's point, this idea about fragmentation, if, you know, the TPLF has bent over pretty much backwards to make this happen, to have this peace agreement signed, to be able to even entertain the idea that some of these things might actually happen, they've bent over backwards. If people start thinking they've bent over too far backwards, if fighters, people who are supposed to be disarming and demobilizing, think that they've given up too much and they break off, then yeah, you're looking at the TPLF as a moderate group. You're looking at a group that is untouchable. I mean, if they go into the mountains, if they decide to fight a guerrilla war, there's just no way. There's just no way to stop them. I hope that the Ethiopian federal government understands that is a different side of a forever war that's never going to end. If you start chasing down groups and you can't negotiate anymore when there's fragmentation, because then you only have somebody speaking for 3/4 of the combatants, or, you know, everybody except the people that you really think are going to do the most damage. This becomes a real problem. And, you know, them saying that the TPLF maybe backtracked on something, I mean, maybe that was a reference to Getch's interview where he was saying that, you know, disarmament could take years. I mean, the DDR process should take years. It should take, you know, at least a year, maybe years. If that whole process was going to happen, it's not. But the disarmament, I mean, yeah, that's going to take a very, very long time. And I don't think that in Tigray they're looking at disarmament. I think they're looking at changing from TDF to Tigrayan regional security forces, some of them being able to keep their weapons, some of them actually then becoming possibly the authorities that are administrating Tigray, because I don't see how any other arrangement is going to be accepted peacefully by the people of Tigray, by these fighters who may or may not demobilize and disarm. So I think that that's possibly what they're thinking. I don't know if that's realistic or not. I don't know if the federal government would go for that. But it seems like a dose of reality into this is probably what Getch was saying when he's saying, you know, years or months or whatever. But it is right now, the recipe's there. The last step of it, I mean, the monitoring, that's a very tricky thing. I mean, the way they set it up is that they're going to have a representative from the TPLF, they're going to have a representative from the Ethiopian government, and then they're going to have this weird monitoring where if there's an infraction, if there's a violation, then they contact the other person, says, please take care of it. If they don't stop whatever the infraction is, then they're going to form another committee to talk about what to do. It doesn't seem like there's no real instrument of enforcement on the Ethiopian side, except for the TPLF will stop whatever progress is making. And it's the same way on the other side. But on the other side, we're talking about food to civilians, and that's the enforcement mechanism. And that's going to be highly problematic. But I'm sorry, I forget who had said it, but the enforcement mechanism and the monitoring mechanism was for something like humanitarian assistance. That already exists. The humanitarian aid going into Tigray is protected by international humanitarian law. If that's broken, then that's a matter for the ICC, and that's a matter that should be taken to the ICC. They need to be, of course, this needs to be referred to them. It could be referred by the UN Security Council. It can be referred to be any member in good standing. I think we saw an example where I believe it was Burma is now on the hot seat because a country had referred it, and this was supposed to be maybe a breakthrough case to where people are able to accuse governments of breaking ICC law and have that play out. But yeah, those instruments and human rights, those instruments already have monitors, and those monitors should be speaking up. There seems to be some sort of like a wink and a nod to, hey, if everybody's shutting up about this, we'll shut up about it too. You don't see Ambassador Power, you don't see the head of the USAID coming out and doing another speech like she did back in May, where she said we have full warehouses full of food, but it's not getting into Tigray. Why is it not getting in? You don't see people standing out and talking about this, Antonio Gutierrez or anybody else, because it seems like everybody feels that they're under this gag order, that let's try to make the peace work, let's not come out and say anything. But how long is that going to last? How many people are going to die before they decide, okay, we're going to talk about this? Because the estimates are between 400 and 900 people a day. So pick that number and get to it and say, am I really going to watch another 10,000 people die? The estimate's about 10 to 21,000 people survive the war, but have been killed in between the time that they signed the peace agreement and now. Are we going to let another 10,000 people, 20,000 people die for the sake of what? To keep this dying show on the road? I mean, they have the recipes there, the ingredients may be there, but it doesn't seem like the Ethiopian government is particularly interested in making this happen, and they do have to move at some point. The Ethiopian government has to make some sacrifice for peace at some point, even if this is their big celebration moment, their big, we defeated the whatever. They need to take real action, and there's a low bar. Allow unfettered humanitarian access, get Eritrea the hell out of Tigray, make Tigray safe, stop the war against the civilians of Tigray, or we might be at June of 2021 and everybody thinks, oh, this thing's pretty much over, and then they get kicked back out of Tigray. God knows what'll happen, but somebody, they need to make a move. There needs to be. I was a little disappointed with some of the phrasing that was used in some of the perspectives that were used in the ICJ report, but the American government needs to be pushing this. The UN needs to be pushing this. If the AU is incapable of enforcing some of these mechanisms, then they're going to need help. The US was not involved, was not a party to this treaty. The UN was not a party to this treaty. If there's a problem with implementation, then it's probably a good time for the US or the UN or the EU to step up and say, okay, we're taking over the atrocities part of this. This is going to be reported. We're going to have something done about this. Have your parallel peace process while this is happening, but we can't excuse a crime that should be referred to the ICC. And so we'll know next week should be a week of activity. There should be plans for disarmament being submitted or being adjudicated, but I can't tell you if that's going to happen or not.
Thank you, Doc. That takes us to the final section, and because of Thanksgiving evening or week, and you three are in the US, I don't want this to take long. So very quick final thoughts from you, each one of you. Yosef, what is your final thought for you? You're muted, I guess.
All right, okay. I have a feeling that the AU is not gonna do it. The UN is not gonna do it. The EU might, but it's only if the US does it. The only body that could do it is the US, and they have been looking at this. You know, this genocide has been happening on Biden's watch. It happened throughout his 2 years of in the White House. Didn't happen before. It happened in this year. It's a slow motion genocide, unlike the case of Rwanda or other genocides. It didn't happen quickly. So I mean, the Biden government has been watching it. It could have easily stopped it using its financial power. They keep pointing their fingers at Russia, at China, but it's not Russia and China that are financing the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians are getting their money from the West and their Arab allies, especially the US. Only this year, I mean, it's estimated that it's about $1.5 billion that they have gotten from the US. And then there is the IMF and the World Bank. So without this money, Abiy couldn't have conducted this war. The threat of the US did it this time precisely because they say we will stop all of this. So it's easy for them, but the reason why they didn't stop it, they have their own reasons. They didn't stop it because they wanted the TPLF to surrender. And they have felt that this time they have almost surrendered, you know. They have no other excuse except to do what they have threatened. Anyway, briefly, what I want to say is now about Eritrea, given that I'm supposedly Eritrean. There is fear in Eritrea right now. As I said before, there is I mean, paranoia inside Eritrea. It's all over Eritrea, and it's total horror that's going on inside Eritrea. There is fear because for few reasons. One is already tens of thousands of Eritrean soldiers have died in this war. And if this war comes to its end, it's time to announce the martyrs, as they call them. And there are tens of thousands also have been injured in this war. But that's not all. Tens of thousands are also fleeing the nation, especially to Sudan, but also including Addis Ababa. Many of them are also arriving in Addis Ababa. So the nation, there is this great fear that out of this war, some kind of given its depopulation, the problem that it have, especially when it comes to the young people, that it could easily collapse. So there is this fear that this war has brought to Eritrea, and it doesn't want to end it precisely because the end of this war, you know, if there is peace, then people are going to return back to Eritrea. All the soldiers are going to, even if the government doesn't tell them, it's easy to tell which families have lost their sons or their fathers. The other one is the fear in the Eritrean government is now that it has lost its relevance to Ethiopia. If there is peace, then the relevance that it has as a player, as a major player in Ethiopia, or with the Amharas, or even, as I said, also it's in an indirect way to the US. The idea of regime change in the neighborhood is being held right now. All of the neighbors, starting from Sudan, which have been destabilized by Eritrea many times, and it's doing right now with the Beja tribes inside. Beja uprising is in the eastern part of Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Somalia, as Faisal knows, and Djibouti. All of them, they want to see Isaias gone. Today, I have heard news that even Tanzania have been complaining about what Eritrea is doing to the Horn of Africa. At that, Egypt, So all of them want the Isaias government gone. And there are rumors that maybe the White House would listen to regime change right now, given that given that the relevance of the Eritrean factor is no more viable over there. So there is that fear. The other one is the third one is the open borders. Eritrea, as any other totalitarian regime, it is open borders is deadly to Eritrea. We have seen that when the borders were opened in 2018, when briefly for about 3 or 4 months, the borders between Tigray and Eritrea were opened. Tens of thousands rushed out of Eritrea. So the fear now is either it has to close all its borders. If it leaves it open, again the problem that it had previously with Tigray, when hundreds of thousands of Eritreans left through Tigray to various corners of the world, that would also come back to haunt it. The fourth one, which is a little bit far-fetched, is that a far-fetched scenario is the fear that if indeed the Abiy government and the TPLF make a lasting peace, then they could gang up against Eritrea, especially when it comes to Assab, which is in the mind of almost all Ethiopians. They could go for Assab. That fear is also coming back. You could hear it from even the opposition groups that are very close, almost close to the old guards, the old guards that have been Sha'biya members but are now residing outside world. They are sounding that alarm that the Ethiopians might go for Assab next time. So all of this has created a paranoia inside, a huge paranoia inside Eritrea. And now for Eritrea, all that it wants to do is destabilize the region. It doesn't know anything better. It kept the power over its people by destabilizing the Eritreans. And now it's doing in Tigray, and potentially now, the bargaining chips that it's collecting inside Eritrea. Inside Eritrea now is one of them is the Demhit movement. Supposedly tens of thousands of Tigrayans that have been kidnapped are being trained to destabilize not Tigray. Remember, don't forget that, but Ethiopia in case it enters this peace agreement. So it is collecting bargaining chips already. With the Fanos, with the Afars, and with disgruntled Tigrayans to destabilize Ethiopia, because that is the only thing it knows. Sorry, I dragged it a little bit, but that's it for me today.
Thank you, Yosef. Faisal, final thoughts?
Yes, I think this civil war, let's hope it will conclude and bring peace to the people in the region. But I think the agreement that we have talked today was understood by America within the context of the US civil war. Most Ethiopians and most people in Africa would understand the conflict between Tigray and Ethiopia as one that has roots on, a trail of political situation, is including the right of self-determination, what have you. But that's not how American mediators see. American mediators see a rebel region like the South revolted against Abraham Lincoln, and everything that they were trying to do was to bring that region under the feet of the federal government. So all the things that we have seen America ignoring the genocide, ignoring the plea of the Tigray, blaming, TPLF, pressuring TPLF to come back when they were only 100 kilometers or miles away from it, reflect America's understanding of the relationship between Tigray and America's history. And I don't know how much Tigray leadership understood that, but even with the negotiation, I was not surprised to find out that America will treat the Tigray region as a small subset whose question should be subjective. to that of the federal, and that's how they really negotiated. And we talked about that. And this agreement, you can tell how TPLF, TDF leadership was really sort of their arms twisted to come to terms, as Getachew said, that was really painful. Sometimes, correctly painful in the sense that this was a very unique condition for the people of Tigray, but at the same time, painful because of what was coming as a pressure, primarily from the US, because the EU was out. So that understanding of America, the Ethiopian history, in light of its own history, has worked against the TPLF, TDF leadership in the negotiation. I think Abiy is confused at this point in time. He's caught in between rock and hard place, in the sense that he's responsible for Tigray and the safety of Tigray and the people of Tigray, period, as the Prime Minister of Ethiopia's 120 million. But he cannot protect, in reality, from the sworn enemy of Tigray, that's Isaias. Isaias is, in the past, he gave Isaias a green light to kill and murder and rape and loot Tigray. Now, when he told the world that, okay, we want to close those doors and come into some sort of reality, he has no get or the political will or ability to tell Eritrea to say that the project has finished, please do something else. He cannot. So he is caught between the agreement and what he called for, what the people of Tigray expect. Because Abiy is under the mind that he is negotiating with leadership and he can lie to the public, not knowing that the public most of the time listen to their leadership, even when their leadership is wrong. In this case, most of the time, Tigray leadership is actually right when it comes to the protection of their people with minor issues here and there. So Abiy probably doesn't know that when he says something and the Tigray leadership says another thing, 99% of the time they will listen to the leadership of Tigray. So the question begs, why can't he tell and show that he is willing and ready to protect the Tigray people and listen to their plea, simply because he is indebted to or afraid of Eritrea, and that's the hard place and the rock in which he is caught. Wants to be a prime minister, but he's a subservient junior to Eritrea. And that's putting Abiy in a very precarious position. The other thing really that is key is that Isaias, not Eritrean people, but Isaias from the 1970s, and I'm not talking about his quarrels with TPLF dealers, with his entanglement with mullahs, because those are here and there ideological. Isaias's ideology from the 1970s up to today was, if he gets the chance to destroy Ethiopia or weaken, because of his existential belief that big and powerful Ethiopia is an antithesis to the sovereign national existence of Eritrea. And as Yosef mentioned, the whole Assab issue is buried now conveniently by primarily the Amara ultra-nationalists. I remember when I used to write for the Ethiopian Review, the forces that now surround Abiy and went to Asmara and being armed Isaias as a marriage convenience were the ones who used to pit, the issue of Afar and Assad as the issue that they will never forgive and forget, the same way that they are saying about Waqaitan. So there are things that are conveniently and temporarily buried, but in the background festering. And more than Walqait and Humara and Raya, for the Amara ultra-nationalists and for Ethiopia's greater nationalists, the Assab issue is not lost. And I'll tell you, it's more important now than ever before. The parties that were stipulated to serve in the Horn of Africa cooperation and integration are now taking a second look. Those who own Somalis are looking a second look after they have seen what had happened to Tigray, people who have been there for 3,000 years together, and how they mutilated and massacred. Somalis are more weary today than ever before about having deep relationship with Ethiopia. They may not express, but in the coffee shops and in the private conversations, the next generation of Somali leadership will try to run away from Ethiopia in miles. That's another headache that came to Abiy as a result of this war. And then the fourth issue I will just touch to conclude is the war of Tigray has been covering for Abiy a lot of internal and serious issues. The entire country was rallied because TPLF and Tigray people were the bad elements to be combated. Now you have multinational groups who are watching what Addis Ababa does in terms of the national question. On top of that, Ethiopia is highly urbanizing. You have a minimum of 20 urban population centers, such as Deredawa, in Jijiga, in Jimma, in Adama, in Awasa, and what have you, in Makale, where the residents are begging and dying for services that a government is supposed to deliver. The next revolution of Ethiopia will not take place at the barrel of the gun, as old revolutionaries said in the 1960s and 70s. The next revolution or civil war will take place because government fails to provide services that people need badly. Primarily, probably will start in Addis Ababa, where low resources and scarce resources in the form of housing and other services will pit one nationality against another, primarily Oromo against Amara. The whole issue of Addis Ababa citizenship and Addis Ababa net, as they call it, who owns Addis Ababa, is nothing more than resource sharing and who gets access to the resources. And that's a recipe for a new form of civil war Ethiopia has yet to see. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Faisal. Look, final thoughts of the show is yours.
I'll be brief. This week coming up, there has to be movement. There has to be movement on the humanitarian aid. They've demonstrated that there are three corridors that can get into Tigray, that there is no obstruction, that food should be moving, pouring in as we speak. If it's not, then the aid is being hindered. There's about 124,000 metric tons of food being held by humanitarian groups in Ethiopia that could go into Tigray. Not, they would need 124,000 metric tons, but they certainly have enough to cover Tigray. They have obligations for another 90 tons of wheat if they need it, if they're able to get it in. That needs to happen this week. There are no more steps to be, even the steps that they've created, these test flights, and then the very small convoys of 15 trucks, because of course, for whatever reason they've decided that we need to have a small convoy first before we send in the big one. These have all played out. We did this the hard way, the long way, the deadly way for Tigrayan civilians. We did all of this to avoid the U.S. offending the Ethiopians, to avoid the Ethiopian government walking away from the table, to whatever the quiet diplomacy was supposed to accomplish. It takes so long for quiet diplomacy to work. And I've worked in projects and programs that have relied on this in something like textbook reform, where you have all the time in the world. I mean, you hope to get it done soon, but you have time. It doesn't work with famine. It doesn't work with starvation. And so we have waited these 2 years for there to be a breakthrough, for there to be peace, and now there's peace. So we did it the hard way. So it's time to have food for the people who need it. It's a basic thing that has to happen. Food, medicine, humanitarian assistance, a shelter over their head, to be able to go back to their land and have something there when they come back, to have agricultural supplies. All of these things need to happen. They need to happen now. There are no more excuses of why they shouldn't happen. Other developments need to happen. The Eritrean troops need to leave. The Amhara regional forces, the Fano, need to leave. Nothing but the Ethiopian National defense forces, and they need to be on their best behavior, and they need to not cause any trouble. Now, is any of that going to happen? God knows. God only knows if any of that's going to happen. But if it doesn't happen next week, they're out of even the excuses they've invented. They don't have those excuses anymore. So if something doesn't happen, there needs to be a reshuffle. There needs to be a reset of the peace process. There needs to be real action coming from the United States to push things in the right direction. Humanitarian assistance has got to lead the way, and if it's unhindered, then show me the truck getting all the way to Europe. Show me the truck getting all the way to the western zone of Tigray. That's unhindered. Unhindered means all the way to Shiraro, all the way across that huge belt of cities that are on the outer, that are a little ways away from Mekelle. Because when you look at the last week, which ended on the 16th, the last week of reporting for food distribution, you see that it's only districts near the capital where food distribution is happening. Nowhere beyond that, nowhere further north than Adgara in the eastern zone, nowhere further west than some of the districts right there in the central zone. These people are being left to their own devices, to their own survival. And we are already in uncharted territory diplomatically by saying that, okay, they're going to starve another week. This is what we had to say last week. They're going to starve another week, but at least we won't have war. That's uncharted territory. How far are we going to go into this horrible, horrible nightmare that's affecting civilians on the ground first? The war against the people of Tigray needs to end. This can't be another development, another peace process that just freezes a genocide in place. This has to stop. And I agree that I think they're looking at this like the Civil War. I think they're looking at this like they did in Oromia back when in 2019 when I was there. They were talking about troublemakers in Oromia. I think they're looking at Tigray as troublemakers, standing in the way of all these beautiful, wonderful reforms that were promised 2 years ago that were never going to come to pass, that are not the Tigrayans' fault, certainly not the civilians who aren't being able to eat right now. It's not their fault. So these things need to happen. We need to get this peace process back into reality, back on the right side of international humanitarian law. This needs to stop being a crime against humanity, which it is right now. Every day that humanitarian access is being blocked or obstructed, even partially, that's a crime against humanity. That is something that needs to stop right now for anybody to take this seriously. And that's my final word. I'm working on the Tigray humanitarian update. I hope to have it out in the next couple of days. They keep changing the numbers on me, so it's difficult. But thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Dirk, Burbridge, Yosef Gabrewat, and Faisal Robler for your time, especially taking this much time from your Thanksgiving evening. And good night from here, and hope to see you next week. Bye. The H panel, one of these flagship programs of UMD Media, is not only online live on the YouTube channel, but also on Horn Broadcasting Services on satellite to the Horn of Africa. So we are on Yahsat, frequency 11843, polarization V, symbol rate 27500. Before I sign off tonight, I just want to make an announcement. On Tuesday, that is November 29th, we have a special panel discussion co-organized with TDRF, that is Tigray Disaster Relief Fund, and with the HPN for Tigray, that is the Health Professionals Network for Tigray. So this is a panel discussion, a virtual one on Clubhouse. It is under the title Tools of a Genocide, Weaponization of Healthcare in the Ongoing Tigray Genocide. That is November 29th, 2020, on Tuesday next week. at 6 p.m. We will start at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll have also entertainment auction as well. TDRF is doing an amazing job of fundraising and dispersing that to the people in need in Tigray, working with charities and um, civil society organizations. And this year, on Tuesday, on Giving Tuesday, so far there has been a lot of fundraising activities, and Tuesday would be the final one. So with MD Media, TDRF Fund, that is Tigray Disaster Relief Fund, and the HBN for Health, that is Health Professionals Network for Tigray, will have a special virtual panel discussion. We'll have experts talking about how healthcare has been weaponized, continues to be weaponized in Tigray. And you will hear from Professor Mulgeta, Professor Tony Maganya, and Professor Mukesh Kapila. These are people who know what they will be talking about, and others as well. Other guests will be there. So tune into Clubhouse, and we have pinned on our YouTube channel today's conversation. We have pinned the the tweet that came from UMD Media on the link to the Clubhouse room on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. To just remind, last year this time, TDRF raised over $100,000 through different campaigns, including the Giving Tuesday on Facebook, donor box auction, Instagram, peer-to-peer on Facebook as well, and people are depositing directly to the bank. And if you go to their website, to DRF, they have in many of their activities listed, including an annual report, how their funding is used, how they disperse it, all that, and so on. So this is a cause to support, and UMD Media is happy to work with TDRF on this campaign. And this campaign is special as well because the goal is to support Eider Hospital. And Eider Hospital, as you know, is the largest specialized comprehensive hospital in Tigray. And its name actually, it came after the Eritrean regime bombed air with aircraft jet, fighter jet back in the 1998-2000 Ethio-Eritrean War, killing students, killing children. And Eider Hospital is named after that area. And Eider Hospital is suffering from lack of medical supplies. And this was Dr. Kubram, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Eider Hospital, speaking to Tigray Television just recently. Let's hear with that, and we'll finish today's show with the word from Dr. Kubram Gabrasilase.
Which happened immediately, all those primary fatalities. But what we have to see is the subsequent days, unless we treat these patients, unless we have the right medications and we do the right procedure, these patients are going to die anyways. Some of them the next day, some of them after some few weeks. So if we had the equipment, if we had the supplies and drugs, then we could have saved some of these victims of the air bombardment and drone attacks. But what happens is...
So that was Dr. Kabram Gabrasilase, who is Chief Executive Officer of Eider Hospital. That was serving actually before the war, the northern part of the Amhara region of Ethiopia as well, the regional referral hospital. So Tuesday, the November 29th, please support what Tigray Disaster Relief Fund is doing in terms of raising fund to support Eider Hospital to get medical supplies, medicine and other necessary equipments for the Idle Hospital in Maqala. That was the show for today. Thank you for tuning in, and those who have followed us live on YouTube, as well as those who are following us on the satellite Horn Broadcasting Services. I'll see you with another show, and if not, we will also come back with H panel next week. Good night. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye.